Well, thank you everybody for coming along. I'm sat in a very cold room in a rather cold Scotland. We're delighted to have Professor Luiz Pessoa speaking today for the SPG, primarily about his book, The Entangled Brain: How Perception, Cognition, and Emotion Are Woven Together, which was published by MIT Press 2022. I read this book a couple of years ago and found it to be incredibly insightful, and I think a challenge to the way perhaps a lot of us in psychiatry have traditionally thought about neuroscience. And it got me thinking a lot about some of the implications that it might have for psychiatry more generally. So Professor Pessoa is not a psychiatrist, so he is a professor of psychology and a member of the Neuroscience and Cognitive Science program at University of Maryland, College Park. And his interests center around interactions between cognition, emotion and motivation in the brain. And his website is emotioncognition.org. I'd also give a shout out to the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon that I'm not sure in what capacity you're involved in, but it's a fantastic resource on YouTube. And I'll share, if there's one video you watch, I suggest the Our Mental Illnesses, Brain Disorders, and I'll link that. And so, as I say, Professor Pessoa is not a psychiatrist, and I'm hopeful that today can be followed by a discussion of some of the implications of his work for psychiatry more widely. So without further ado, I'll hand over. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I'm really delighted to be here, and I really would be fun for me to engage in a conversation and know the kinds of questions that you might have, so that in future iterations of the works that I write more broadly, I can aim to address those points. Okay, so let me get started. Okay, so the starting point that I want to provide is, let's consider it a goal that we might have now that AI is all the rage, that a group is planning on developing an artificial brain and has to decide on what exact architecture it should have. So a natural choice would be to have components such as perception that would fit into cognition, that would fit it into action. I don't know, my cursor is, let me actually also make my cursor visible. Yeah, I think that would be. So by having just perception, cognition, and action might be insufficient. So it would be maybe natural to include, for instance, an emotion component to this architecture, perhaps to downregulate some of the actions so that this robot doesn't get out of control. And so you would have something like a link between cognition and emotion, so that cognition dampens emotion. You could also have a component that we might label motivation to sort of reinforce previous behaviors that led to perceiving or having cognitions of certain kinds that were associated with prior rewards. But the bottom line, however you might want to limit or extend this architecture, the bottom line is that we would envision it in an AI or computer science or an engineering sense as basically developed in a modular fashion. By modular fashion, what I mean is that you literally can extract the one component that you want, for instance, the cognition component, and you put the next version, the GPT 5 point something, you insert there, and the cognitive machinery is enhanced, and it works fine with all the rest of the architecture, other components. But how about biological brains? How is the actual biological brain organized? How are behavioral functions and mental states supported by the brain? And what are the implications for mental processes? So that's what I'm going to try to cover in the next half hour or so, 40 minutes or so. So what is the brain? At the broadest level, one can envision or can conceptualize the brain at the systems level in terms of 100 to 200 cortical brain areas that subdivide the entire cortical mass, plus subcortical areas, areas in the midbrain and hindbrain and so forth, but basically subdivided into elementary area components. What are areas? So if we go back more than 100 years, there was already a very well established heuristic to think about and to search and investigate areas by looking at differences in the structural organization of tissues, let's say in the cortex. So the idea was that you would focus on looking at, under the microscope, at the density of cells, the cell types, the cell distribution, cell type distribution, and so on and so forth. And based on potential differences between one patch of cortex and another patch of cortex, or between one subcortical area and another subcortical patch, I should say, then you could define them and delimit them as areas. But the important point here is not only anatomical, it's functional. The functional units then, the functional units of the cortex then become these areas. And very much related arguments exist for parts of the brain that are non-cortical. What exactly are areas? Well, if we then fast forward from the early 1900s to the 1950s, for instance, with the computation as a mathematical, logical entity, as well as a physical device, we then get into incorporating a computational metaphor that very much defines how we think of areas. Areas compute, implement specific functions that, given certain inputs, generate outputs. So brain areas, which are the units of the brain, compute functions. A neuroscientist, for instance, who is interested in understanding the brain, then has her task very well outlined. It's a simple one of the good old Cartesian approach of decomposition and divide and conquer, or put another way, divide and conquer, right? So I might be interested in this brain region and study it for a few years and understand what it does. Then I go a few years later, I go to this brain region, or some other group does that for me, does that for the field, and visit another area, and so on and so forth, until we cover the entire brain, including subcortical areas, and our job is more or less done, because like in a given machine, the mechanism is, once the parts are well functioning, the understanding of the collective of the whole is somewhat directly related to the function of the individual parts. So this strategy of understanding the brain can be considered, in my view, defensible if the brain, as a biological system that empirically we have to determine how it's organized, happens to be what is called nearly decomposable. And this is a concept that is very important, that was outlined in the early 1960s by Herbert Simon, that proposed in a very influential paper that scientists frequently are interested in systems that have this property of near complete decomposability. So you can study something scientifically from, let's say, the biological realm by decomposing it into individual parts and studying them, and then kind of piecing everything back together. But what kind of system is the brain? If we think of it as a spectrum, we can think of the end of the spectrum that was outlined by Simon of strong decomposability is one, but many types of organization that this, logically speaking, that this biological system might exhibit. Going through weak forms of decomposability in which the parts are more interdependent, to perhaps architectures that are strongly non-decomposable in the sense that understanding one part requires, for instance, understanding almost all other parts simultaneously in some complex, perhaps non-linear fashion. If it interacts with these three regions, it does something different than interacting with these other four regions, and so on. You can imagine, at least from a logical standpoint, many different scenarios. So in answering what kind of system is the brain, I outlined in previous work a few principles, some of which I'm going to discuss today, that help us try to address this question, which is something that has to be determined empirically, and it's ongoing effort. In fact, for a century and a half, one can say that that has been the mission, one of the important goals of neuroscience. So the first principle that I would like to outline is the existence of, or the presence of massive combinatorial anatomical connectivity throughout the brain. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that both cortical and subcortical brain regions are extremely densely interconnected, in the sense that if I take certain subparts of the temporal cortex here, or the insula, or the parietal cortex, or the frontal cortex, it takes just one or two or three connections to be able to reach another sector of the brain, because it is so highly and so densely interconnected that if you imagine two disparate points, the degrees of separation, as sometimes it's phrased, are a relatively low number of steps. So this is purely based on existing anatomical information. If we collate over hundreds and now thousands of studies, we observe this type of organization. And that applies not only to the cortex, as I was showing before, right? So like, for instance, the cingulate cortex, the frontal cortex, and so on and so forth, but to subcortical territories that I indicate briefly here and illustrate in the case, for instance, of the amygdala, which is a subcortical region that is very important for many functions, and is very popularly described as involved in fear processing. But this region itself is actually very densely connected to a lot of the cortex, with hundreds of connections that have been documented. Okay, the second concept is a functional one. So we started with an anatomical concept. The second principle is functional. So is the need to understand this concept of signal interaction and coordination, and understanding the notion that there's a highly distributed functional interactions and signal coordination in the brain, which I'll try to explain a little bit here. So it basically forces us to move from the plane of an anatomical description to one of a general space, if you will, of functional relationships between areas. So in this sense, what we need to understand is, if a brain patch, or let's call it area for now, if a brain area has a certain signal that evolves in time, it might be measured by EEG, magnetoencephalography, MEG, or fMRI, or intracellular recordings, or electrophysiology, any kind of recording, that it has some kind of signal, ongoing signal there. And you can extract the corresponding signals for different disparate parts of the brain. And mathematically, computationally, you can establish relationships between these signals. For instance, the simplest one that you can imagine is that the signals in, let's say, this blue patch here, and this blue region and this green region are actually synchronized. So every time that region A goes up and down in its own variability in signal, the other region also is synchronized to it, undergoing a very correlated type of activity. So what we have here is that there's a space of functional relationships that can be studied across regions, that these relationships can be pairwise or even beyond just two regions, multiple region relationships. But the important point here is that these relationships that need to be extracted by our analyzing data are mathematical relationships that point to functional relationships between regions. For instance, these signals, by working in a synchronized fashion, might be part of a coherent ensemble of group or cluster of regions that work together in a given task or in a given mental state. So the distinction, the relationship between the anatomical and the anatomical and the functional principles is important to kind of grasp, and sometimes it's a little bit unclear. So one attempt that I've had at this is to consider, for instance, if you consider the Roman Empire's enormous reach across the globe 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, this was supported by an enormous range of physical infrastructure or roads. So these are the physical connections, making an analogy to the case of the brain. However, these roads actually exist there and support multiple types of economic, cultural, and other social relationships and coordinations between very disparate parts of the empire, the Roman Empire, that are possible, are emerge out of from this backbone of physical infrastructure. So one way to think about the anatomical and functional is that they're highly interrelated, but it's also really important to understand that the functional relationships, or in this case, the economic cultural relationships, are not easily grasped or measured by just looking at the physical infrastructure. You have to really measure something that has to do with economic and cultural norms and events to establish these, which depend on the anatomical but exist in their own realm. So another principle that I like to highlight is high context dependence. And so what I mean by that is that this amount of signal distribution that is possible across the brain that leads to some combinatorial possibility space, if you will, of signals being able to be combined, supports an enormous amount of context dependence in the way that brain functions are carried out and support behaviors. So whenever there's a certain kind of behavior or mental state, many dimensions that we could go on for a long time, there's just a few here that we can highlight, such as familiarity with the situation or the stimulus or the conditions or the task, the attention being devoted to the components of the world, the context, in the case of humans, the social context in which the behavior is occurring, emotional motivational factors, whether certain actions are possible or not possible in that case. So all of those make brain processing actually extremely highly context dependent. It's not invariant and fixed, but something that is highly malleable. And there are many ways to understand this principle of context dependence. And some of them have to do with computational principles and other kinds of things that are a little more formal. But one thing that is, I think, more intuitive is the fact that we know that neuronal circuits, they're engaged and perform functions differently. They perform different functions, in fact, based on the action of neuromodulators. And neuromodulators such as the chemicals that we are all very familiar with, including serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and so on and so forth. If you put these three principles together, one way to think about it is that, and together with a few other things that you can, if you're interested, I'll suggest some readings, they lead to the suggestion that instead of thinking of brain areas as the functional units of the brain, we should be thinking of functional units as dynamic networks or circuits. So I use networks and circuits interchangeably here, not making a distinction. Sometimes neuroscientists make a little distinction, make a bit of a distinction between them, but here we don't have to consider those. So these circuits are composed of many patches or areas, if you will, many areas of the brain that are linked directly or indirectly via anatomical pathways that function in a cohesive, coherent fashion as the functional unit that we need to understand. So moving away from a brain area, okay, there's Broca's area, there is the amygdala, there is the part of this subgenial prefrontal cortex, and whatever in the parietal cortex, and so on and so forth, is actually moving to the domain of networks or circuits instead of brain areas. And these these circuits, I should say, they're not static in the sense that, for instance, Brodmann more than 100 years ago proposed that area 46 in the brain was in the prefrontal cortex, and you can point to it. These are dynamically evolving and recruited assemblies of multi-region collections that instantiate important functions at a given point in time. So in lacking movie clip skills, I just put some arrows here to remind us that this is supposed to be dynamic and not something that is statically glued onto the brain that you can point, oh, this is one network right here. Okay, so what kinds of brain networks? So if the brain networks and circuits are important, what kind of, what do I mean? So I think it's useful to distinguish two kinds. One kind is, for a lack of imagination, and it's a little bit dull, but I call it type 1 networks, are just networks in which certain patches of the brain might have, let's say, have specific functions or sub-functions, more elementary functions, basic functions, such as, for instance, a patch here in the so-called fusiform gyrus might be extremely important for face perception. Some patch in the superior temporal sulcus might be really important for face and body movement. Some patch in the temporal parietal cortex junction might be really sensitive to the social content. I'm speaking here without an audience, so maybe it's a different social context than if I'm speaking in a large lecture room, and so on and so forth. So the networks here exist based on these localized subareas or patches of cortex or subcortex too. But what I want to highlight is that even though there might be regions of the brain that have a relative and sometimes a little strong functional specialization, typically for most functions that of interest to people outside of neuroscience for sure, but even in neuroscience, these functions really should be thought at the network level, in the sense that these patches or areas are highly interactive. The signals are going back and forth between them and influencing them dynamically. So this is all something, again, it's a movie. You should be thought of, everything that I'm showing here should be a movie and not some static picture, because the temporal dimension is really fundamental in our understanding here. So for instance, when I'm processing or gathering or sensitive to the social meaning of this situation, which I am now, that we're doing this over Zoom, and the people are in another country, in another continent, and so on and so forth, it might be something that has to do with, it is something, I would claim, that has to do with a circuit that is not localizable in one given little patch it's actually something that is distributed across space. But one of the things that I think is extremely important is this one, in one sense, is how neuroscience thinks a lot about how the brain works, right? So some regions have some or a lot of specialization, but they still have to talk to other regions and communicate with other regions to support more complex behaviors. But what I like to suggest is that in many instances, the functional unit is a network, in this case, type 2 network, in which the function itself is distributed. So what I mean by that is that here I pointed, okay, here I'm calling this is more involved in face perception, and this has a certain specialization for face or body movements and so on. So I'm localizing things. In this case here, we don't localize things because it is the multiple regions working together that instantiate the basic function of interest. So the basic function itself is distributed across regions. So what that means is that you can't point to this little patch and say that it's carrying out a given function that you can point to, because it is actually participating with other regions to generate a function that is spatially distributed. And the concept that I've been trying to develop based on my work and the work of many people is that this is a really important principle of organization of the brain that hasn't been studied as much, mostly because we haven't had the technology to measure these signals electrophysiologically in multiple regions at the same time, because until the 90s, we were measuring the responses of a few neurons in one little patch of the brain and characterizing that little patch individually and moving to a different patch, because we just simply didn't have the technology to measure multiple locations at the same time and understand the relationships between their signals and have mathematical and computational techniques to try to put those together and see what kind of functions they jointly instantiate. So basically, the idea here is that we have to move from a viewpoint, like a mechanistic viewpoint that I outlined in the beginning with that clock, that watch, moving from that kind of description or thinking into a realm of thinking about the brain as a complex system in which the circuit properties of interest really require us to understand how multiple brain regions are working simultaneously. And these regions may be kind of adjacent to each other, but not necessarily. Many really important circuits will involve frontal parietal regions, and almost all these circuits are interlinked with the thalamus that is bidirectionally connected with these regions, or via basal ganglia loops and all sorts of anatomical substrates that, if you're interested, you can take a look at the books that talks about them in a very high level manner, not in a neuroscience textbook fashion. So we do have these kinds of networks, but the important point here is to suggest, or the suggestion that I'm making is that we have to be considering these functions as emergent functions that emerge out of these interactions between regions that are highly complex. They're bidirectional, they're non-linear interactions. So it's something that it is not going to be easy to figure out exactly what they're doing without some considerable amount of mathematical sophistication, because it's not a linear system such that when you add a third component, you become 1/3 more strong. It can actually shut things down. It can have completely kinds of behaviors that are really far from linear. It can inhibit things and so on and so forth. Yet, we often study the brain in a fashion that quite deviates from what I said. And in a sense that we try to take these mental domains that have existed for a long time, some of them for hundreds of years, and try to map them to individual territories of the brain. All right, so you have the back of the brain here, occipital cortex is perception, visual perception, and you have a big chunk of prefrontal cortex that is highly associated with cognition, and so on and so forth. The way we study the brain is exemplified by any really good textbook. This is a really good textbook that from actually good friends of mine. It's really good. But what does it do? It does talk about a chapter is perception, a chapter is attention, and so on and so forth. And there are some relationships between these, and they're going to be discussed. But it's one, again, of subdividing the brain into subdividing the mental realm into mental domains that map to coherent portions of the brain. So let me just briefly give an example, and we can, when I get to 40 minutes here, I'll stop, and then we can have questions. But let me give an example of the emotion in the brain, which is something that I've been working on for a couple of decades. So historically, if we think historically, in the late 40s, the beginning of the 50s, Paul MacLean came up with the concept of the limbic system, the visceral brain. Certain areas and territories were really important for emotion. The hypothalamus, since the 20s and 30s by Cannon and Bard. The hippocampus was previous the case of HM with his lesion in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus was thought to be really important for emotion. It is involved in emotion processes to this day. Our understanding, neuroscientific understanding bears that much, but it was thought to be as a highly central region. If we fast forward to more or less around today, we see a different set of areas that are thought to be more important, or the important regions. But the idea of dedicated areas and the concept of an emotional brain is alive and well. And even more so, that there's a set of regions within this set of regions. There has always been one or two regions that have been really played an important role as sort of like the hub or center, the center of the emotional brain. In the 1920s and the 1950s was the hypothalamus. In the past 30 years or so, I think it's probably fair to claim it we might speak of the amygdala. But if we remember the things that we were talking about, not only the anatomical, but the other considerations, just a simple reminder that the amygdala, for instance, is highly interconnected. So to be a region that is the center of something and at the same time be so deeply interconnected bidirectionally, such that it influences and is influenced by many other regions, it becomes a little problematic, and especially in the view that we have to think about the functional domain. So when we put this whole set of principles and the circuit as the unit together, and these emergent properties, we come to this concept that I like to call interactional complexity. So interactional complexity is just a way to speak about this type of emergent behaviors that occur without invoking the word emergence, which really gets people very excited and leads to, I think, lots of distraction. So I like to discuss it in terms of a range of interactional complexities, potential interactional complexity levels, and this high level of interactional complexity of the brain. What are some of the implications of this complexity? So let me give you an example, and then I'll stop, of fear extinction. So let me remind you about fear extinction. So fear conditioning, the traditional Pavlovian fear conditioning, pairing a tone to a shock and so on and so forth, when that is established, the animal learns that the CS plus is paired with the shock. it becomes a CS plus, a conditioned stimulus. But after fear conditioning is established, if you present the tone by itself and not followed by the shock, the animal naturally learns that the tone is not paired with the shock. And after a few of these repetitions, it learns that the tone is not to be feared anymore. And so it learns that it's actually a safe stimulus. So this phenomenon that I just described is called extinction, fear extinction. What that means is that the CS plus, the tone, ceases to generate the conditioned response. The typical one in the laboratory is because the mouse is in a little cage, a tiny little cage, the mouse can't run anywhere to avoid the shock, so it freezes. So the animal, upon hearing the tone, does not freeze anymore. The freezing was considered to be a sign that the animal feared the tone. Now it doesn't freeze anymore. So it's extinguished. Fear has extinguished. So let's see one example of the implications of this idea of interactional complexity. So in the early 90s, there were really important studies by Joe Ledoux, and many other neuroscientists that outlined a potential circuit that was really key to the behavior or the learning of extinction, meaning to learn to not to fear the tone. And the circuit that was identified was the following. A region in the medial prefrontal cortex was proposed to inhibit parts of the amygdala, the basolateral amygdala, and receive information about the context in which the animal is situated, what cage it's in. The hippocampus is highly sensitive to context, the location of the animal, and so on and so forth. So the animal would learn to inhibit its fear by using its frontal cortex in this circuit such that it could regulate your fear response based on context. And here, this is just the animal was the study was in rats, I should say, but this is just a little diagram in humans. So which we haven't worked out the exact mechanisms for obvious reasons. We cannot do invasive studies in humans, but functional MRI studies and other studies are consistent with the idea, partly consistent with the idea that the medial prefrontal cortex is interacting with the amygdala, possibly in an inhibitory fashion. If we fast forward, if we go ahead from the early 1990s, 10 or 20 or so years, what happened if we look at that time frame? What happened was that the story became a lot more complex. The study identified connections and then lesioned the medial prefrontal cortex of the rat, and noticed that this regulation was decreased with lesioning it. However, as we started understanding the circuit itself, the anatomy itself, just the anatomy, things started to look a little different, because the medial prefrontal cortex and the basolateral amygdala are connected actually bidirectionally. The basolateral amygdala is bidirectionally connected with the hippocampus. So the circuit started having many additional nuances. And in addition to that, the circuit was gradually expanding such that even a mini circuit looks like this nowadays. So in the 1990s, one could say that this was the mini circuit. People understood that other regions might be influencing things, but you could consider it a minimal circuit to be comprised of these three regions. Obviously, some other regions of the brain connect to the medial prefrontal cortex, and neuroscientists knew that. But for this behavior was thought to embody or explain most of the literature or the phenomenon, or I should say, of fear extinction. So this circuit now has expanded considerably. And one of the things that happens in this case is that even the causal flow of the signals, the information that flows through a circuit like that, is far from simple. It's not unidirectional. It's really hard to attribute causation to a given region in a circuit like that. In the previous circuit, it was very easy to say that there was a causal role of the medial prefrontal cortex in projecting to the amygdala. It was directional. Now we find responses in the amygdala. Now it's measuring functionally, physiologically, responses in the amygdala that carry signals related to extinction that even seem to precede signals from the medial prefrontal cortex that are related to, temporally precede the signals that one observes in the medial prefrontal cortex. So even the causal flow now is quite difficult. So let me just conclude by saying that the implications of this interactional complexity is that if we consider simple decompositions of the brain and we insulate circuits in this manner, we might be capturing something important. For instance, the medial prefrontal cortex does contribute to fear extinction, but it's really a minor portion of the entire contributions that are the contributions of multiple brain parts to the behavioral effect that is studied. And this is not something that is just basic neuroscientists that are working out and are interested in all these. It's not something that, oh, it's all this biological detail is beautiful for a neuroscientist, but who cares? Because if you think about it, fear extinction is something really fundamental. It's unlearning fear, right? It's fear unlearning. So fear extinction research has naturally informed treatments, for instance, involving phobias and PTSD. However, in both laboratory animals and humans, the procedures to extinguish behavior, extinction, actually lead to multiple side effects. For instance, a temporary increase of the very behavior that is being extinguished. So it's a paradoxical increase instead of decrease. A return of other behaviors previously extinguished. Increased frequency of undesirable behaviors such as aggression. So there's a whole range of dark matter, so to speak, phenomena that exist, but we don't know how they arise and how they come about at the circuit level, because in my view, it leads us to a certain amount of myopia to just consider these minimal isolated subcircuits that are involved, but are really just one portion of a much more intricate set of interactions that are involved in complex behaviors that humans and animals exhibit. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Louis. That was incredibly interesting and very, I think, provoked lots of different questions in my mind. As usual, I always have lots of things to ask. I'll maybe just start off with one question and then open it up to the floor,
Sure.
if that's okay. So, it might need a little bit of setting up. So just for people not familiar with the concept of multiple realizability, and please correct me if I say anything that is incorrect, Louis.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So this is the idea that when we're thinking in terms of functions rather than structure, it becomes apparent that the same function can be instantiated in different ways, so it can be multiply realized. And one of the things I've been wondering about is, given that we know dynamical systems can be very adaptive as well as being robust. Is it possible or even likely that some of the phenomena that we deal with as psychiatrists, so let's use depression as an example, which is a very heterogeneous term in and of itself.
Right.
But
Sure.
is it feasible or possible or probable that a phenomena like depression is multiply realizable to the point where brain circuits might not be the best, represent the best level of explanation? Could it get to the point where, if for whatever reason, if we think of depression as an attractor state and the system just keeps
Yeah, right.
go back into that attractor state,
Yeah, sure.
and if it could be potentially multiply realized by various different circuits
Yeah,
in
yeah.
different is it, I suppose what I might, is it possible that we might not be able to explain some of the phenomena that we see
Yeah, and so
at the
yeah,
level of circuits?
so if anyone is interested, I have this piece in the Eon magazine about the brain, and in the last few paragraphs, I discuss depression and other conditions and how this framework, what implications it might have. And I think this is a very difficult question for many reasons, but so I'll just give a first pass answer, and then we can continue if you want. But essentially, I think we have to differentiate a couple of things here. One of which is the fact that given that depression seems so heterogeneous, we might have, let's say, easily, just simplifying for now, let's say 6 subtypes. Let's say there are 6 subtypes that account for, I don't know, 50% or a good amount of the population that can be considered to be depressed, to have MDD or some other type of classification. So in a very basic sense, it is going to be extremely important to distinguish that the subtypes of the conditions that we are interested in mental health, assuming that one is in agreement that they're highly heterogeneous across individuals, and there's multiple subtypes, they will map to different types of circuits, not a single, but multiple circuits that might be functioning in ways that are that impair a person's life, the well-being of a person's life, right? So in that sense, even already at that point, we need to start pointing to multiple classes of systems and circuits that are involved. But even when you bring it to one subtype, suppose there are well-defined subtypes. Maybe it's much more continuous, so maybe the subtypes is not a great idea. But suppose there are some subtypes of depression, and even in that subtype, I would say that a person's individual history is such that it will alter enough of how the brain is functioning, memory circuits, memory related circuits, and multiple circuits, how they interact, that I don't think that there's going to be a really simple brain target that will be easily identified and whose function, if we altered and brought back to a more normal and quote unquote range, that the person's life would improve. So I don't think that mapping is straightforward, because the mapping itself is so contextually dependent and temporally, contextually. Time is the context too, right? So temporal timing and contextually dependent in a way that it's going to be incredibly difficult to isolate these components. I don't think, however, that it is the case that it would, this is an empirical question, which is easy for neuroscientists to say, but it's really hard for the hundreds of millions of people who greatly suffer. It becomes an empirical question whether there's going to be subtypes, that there's a type of imbalance in the system, or a different balance relative to other individuals. There's a type of balance or imbalance in the system that is so dominant, so to speak, that in those cases, for those patients at that point in time in their lives, it can isolate a little more easily. So for instance, it is possible that some individuals do have certain components of a system that are hyperactive or hypoactive, considerably so, that greatly alter the circuit function in a more major way than some other of the components. So they might have perhaps their distribution of receptor distribution that they have in certain regions is much more sensitive to certain neurotransmitters, or the receptor distribution or the genetic chemical profile of the subcircuits that they happen to have deviates so much from that are sufficient, that are powerful enough to make the entirety of a circuit or multiple circuits behave in ways that are highly undesirable in terms of quality of well-being. So I do think that it is possible. So I think that when one brings complexity also has to be understood in that sense, that there are complex systems that have some components that have incredible amount of influence on the rest of the circuit. So if you have an ecological system, you have these, what are they called? Keystone species? I forget now, but they have certain, there are these studies about the gray wolf in Yellowstone. And then when that species goes up or down, it has an enormous cascade of effects. So it's a highly complex interactive system in ecological settings, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that everyone is playing the same role. So that's really important to understand, is that the effects are contextual, because, for instance, one species might have a great effect when there's some other two species that are also doing a certain thing. Mm-hmm. But perhaps in some circumstances, the apex species have a huge effect almost regardless. So we're going to have to work those things out. It is not that there is no hope of understanding some regularity or some mapping that can be done, if we understand that in most cases it could be highly context sensitive and could be dynamic and in ways that interact with many other things to have more or a little bit less of an effect. In some cases, the more is going to be very powerful. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, that does. Thank you. I'll hold off for now and open it to the floor. George, hi, good to see you, and I can see that. So apologies, John, if you had your hand up for a while. I'll go to George because I've just seen his hand go up, and then to John.
Thank you, Professor Pessoa. Reading your prequel to your book in the Philosophical Transactions paper you wrote was an act of liberation for me. So thank you very much. And what you've given is a wonderful answer now. And I'd like maybe to try and concretize it a little bit.
Please.
Depending how much time I have. First, I'll make some statements that my colleagues may think are obvious or provocations. And then if our chair wants us to, I'll say a little bit more, or I'll stop at the beginning. But so here are my three theses, which I think follow from the answer you've just given in your whole talk. Biological factors are important in psychiatry in two ways. One, the patient may have thyroid disease or a brain tumor or something else, and you need some sort of physician to pick that up. If you don't have a psychiatrist who knows that stuff, you won't pick it up. But that's a minority. That's not a majority of problems we're dealing with, especially when we're talking about anxiety, depression, but also psychosis, to be frank. So in that sense, we can debate how much of psychiatry is biological. At the extreme, I'd say 20%. Others may say 40%. But others may put an even bigger figure. In that sense, I would say that although psychiatry is a part of medicine, based on what you've been saying, it's as different from internal medicine as internal medicine is from surgery, though both are medical specialties. And finally, I think one implication of what you're saying, and I think you were saying as much in your answer as just now, is we really need to up our game in terms of training in understanding language or systems of communication and meaning and value and culture. And incidentally, Lawrence Kermeyer has co-edited a wonderful book on mind, culture, and brain that is worth reading. It's a wonderful book. So these are my theses or provocations, if you want. And if I have time, I can say a little bit more on the basis of a book I've been co-editing and an editorial we've just had accepted.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I'm sorry.
No, I'll stop there. I'm very keen on your answer. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I agree. I resonate with these points very much. And given that this is being recorded and going to be put on a public access, I hesitate a little, but I'm a little still tempted to say on the question whether psychiatry is 10%, 20%, 50%, what have you, whatever percentage biological, I have two points to make. One is that if we take the kinds of things that I was talking about and sort of iterate them beyond what I was talking to consider, I think what you alluded to, cultural factors, social factors, that we're social beings. So if we expand things, in one sense, I don't view the biological as completely separate or as separate from these other realms. They're sort of co-determining, they co-determine each other, they coexist, they mutually define one another in ways that I think that are not sufficiently appreciated. However, that is not to say that. So what I'm trying to say is, it seems a little bit trying to say it's not all in the brain, and it's not a productive way to think about it. And in that sense, it maps to, okay, what percentage of it is psychiatry is the brain? Is it 10% or what have you? So I don't think that. So what I would say is that I view it much more of a spectrum. Having said that, it's intertwined with these other components of the social and other domains in which humans exist, their environment, including their social environment, social culture environment. I do think that we we cannot neglect the fact that we are biological beings. So it is not that everything maps back in some unique, fundamental, and causally dominant factor of biology. We have to transcend that type of view. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are ways in which our biology can have major impact as well. So there are circumstances in which it is possible, as I was saying, in terms of complex systems, that there's a certain kind of altered functioning in certain circuits of the brain that could lead to very altered mental health, mental illness scenarios. So in some cases, the contribution could be sort of, it's almost ill-defined in a sense, because you can start by saying that it doesn't determine it, but it's I think it's better to think of it as a whole spectrum of possibilities. In some cases, it might be more extreme, like for instance, something like a tumor, right? So you have a tumor that is impacting a certain part of the brain and whatnot. You can imagine that in some circumstances, there's certain alterations of this system that are magnified to such an extent that the biological contribution becomes preponderant. So I really don't think that we should, I think it's 20%, that person is thinks it's 30%, and someone else is 7%, or someone is 0%, whatever. I guess that's a little different if it's 0%, but that I think we should really view it in a little bit more flexible way as a whole range that is, again, together with in the spirit of the theme that I'm adopting, that it's a spectrum that depends on how these complex systems interact with these other complex systems that we have in culture, social, environmental factors.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to John because he's been waiting very patiently with his hand up, and then.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm interested in your thoughts on this big question of how the brain generates consciousness and how that might be disturbed in conditions like psychosis or psychedelic drug use.
I will have to pass on that one because I have way too many colleagues that are experts on that, and I think I cannot do justice to such a monumentally challenging question as to to speak to as to how certain alterations in the brain lead to changes in consciousness and states and types of conscious states, and that is something that my reach doesn't extend there, so I have to apologize.
Thank you anyway.
So I can see George, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. So I want to come back to what Luiz was just saying, and the impossibility really of partialing out bio, psycho, and social. And I think here evolutionary psychiatry can help us a lot. And I come back to an earlier point, which is about language. Language is evolutionarily, it's an evolved biological function, which is psychological and is primarily social. And when I talk about language, I don't just mean words, but I mean meaning and signification and communication. And the point I was really trying to make earlier is that we need to engage more as psychiatrists with that. I think over the last 30 years, we've engaged disproportionately with the brain in relation to these other integrated functions. And this is where I think Lawrence Kermeyer's edited book is superb in my opinion. I'll finish by saying I'm co-editing now a book that is with the printers at the moment on psychiatry after Kreppeling, and interestingly, the period coincides with the period you covered. You start in 1903. We start what we call the long 20th century of psychiatry from 1899, when schizophrenia was described by Krepelin, and we end it in 2025, which is the anniversary, the centenary of his death. But Mike Owen, probably Britain's most distinguished psychiatric geneticist, has said that the search for discrete natural kinds as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, has failed. And I think that is the important thing. That doesn't mean, as you say, that a brain tumor may not be important or some brain circuits may not be important. I think they may be, but equally we ought to be looking at these other factors and whether they might not be more important than we've thought until now.
I completely agree. As a neuroscientist, I would say that is sort of disappointing to see how society has reacted to this it's almost like a sort of like a magic bullet to everything, mental health, but also, you know, how I learn or how I remember. Everything is some simple thing in the brain. You know, so I think that we've done a disservice in letting, I mean, I don't know how to counteract it, but an enormous industry of propagating these overly simplistic ideas about the brain, and in all these domains, all the way in as you said, in dominating psychiatry, but also many other. I just came from a conference this past weekend on education, and you know, their hope is give me a talk in which you talk about what I can do so that people will learn better from what you know about the brain. And it's really sad because neuroscience is nowhere near, if ever is going to be there, because in fact these might be quite separate domains that we're looking at the wrong place. But it's unfortunate that I think, just to conclude, that I think that neuroscientists have a lot of responsibility, because since the 2000s, the National Institute of Mental Health in America, at least, really promoted this view that if we can only isolate genetically, neurochemically, chemically, and otherwise these circuits that are malfunctioning, we're going to fix things, and we're going to make great progress. And I think that was an incredibly simplistic viewpoint that was defended by very powerful people that steered funding in a direction that has been great for neuroscientists to understand basic properties of the brain, but hasn't translated in almost anything of utility to the well-being of humans, in our understanding of mental health. And so it's really unfortunate. It's disappointing to be part of an enterprise that has, I think, to be honest, again, being mindful this is going to be online, sort of failed in offering something. I don't know how much we sold this hope as well, but we certainly went after the funding and embraced a paradigm that tried to reduce these extremely complex mental phenomena socially and culturally embedded into some imbalance of 2 molecules, 3 molecules in 4 brain regions. Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks very much for that talk. It was really interesting. I mean, I'm just wondering what you think of the idea that the whole concept of seeing the brain as kind of like in a mechanistic fashion, as like a super complicated computer, I suppose, is the kind of most popular metaphor at the moment. I mean, I'm just wondering how much you think that's actually helpful, or if it's actually leads our thinking about how people work down a blind hole, really. Because I think, there's also the whole, we don't have time to get into the whole thing about artificial intelligence and the idea that intelligence and consciousness is just about a whole load of connections within a machine, when in fact, even just the idea that you can view humans just as individuals divorced from their social and environmental and cultural context is, I think, absurdly reductive. And I don't want to be rude to neuroscientists, but I think the kind of neuroscientific paradigm of the brain as a machine, I think, has been in a lot of ways entirely unhelpful. And you think of the research that's done about how the brain actually isn't the whole story. There's your whole gut's nervous system, there's all the bacteria that live in your gut, there's any number of things that affect your emotional and cognitive state, and that this kind of reductive view of the brain as a machine is really that helpful. But sorry, I'm rambling a bit now, but I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Thank you. I think this is a really important question because of the following. I think there is no question that a mechanistic type of analytical mechanistic approach in science has been enormously productive across the centuries. And I think that it made a lot of sense to continue along that direction in the decades of the last century for a good amount of time, because it's an entry point into any system, right? So basically, we are limited beings, humans, in terms of knowledge and in terms of everything. And so to understand something as complex as the brain, it does make sense that going into this mechanistic Cartesian type of approach makes sense as a first approach. But I think what happened is that in biology, especially with the development of genetics and molecular biology in the beginning in the 50s and taking off in the 60s and 70s, it really, we learned an incredible amount, but I think an unfortunate byproduct of that has been this massively reductionistic approach in which we think that the lower levels are always the most basic and fundamental ones, and that everything that is at a higher level will map in a neat way or will be derivable from functions and operations and computations or what have you of this lower level, and not to understand that the complexity of these interlevel phenomena and the existence of phenomena that exist at a natural level, irrespective of the lower levels, if you will. So I basically think that it made sense, but it's unfortunate because since the 50s and 60s, and so I should preface this by the fact that in science in general, we did not understand complexity. We didn't have tools to understand complexity. So I think it was inevitable because we just didn't have a way to grasp complexity. But starting in the 50s and obviously going back many decades since the 1890s already in math and whatnot, we had a few inklings and a few tools that starting in the 50s started being built so that we could really understand complexity from a formal standpoint, both mathematically and computationally. And so at that point, what we see is that many scientists who developed this, but also were utilizing these ideas to understand biology, neuroscience, and other things, they took that perspective of complexity science, complex systems, and they offered a different view that was really an incredibly minority view, unfortunately. Because I think that a combination of this, we wrote a short piece with some colleagues from the University of Sussex and other places, briefly talking about this need for both bottom-up and top-down approaches in this sense that, yes, we need to understand the basic levels, but we also need to have understanding of these higher levels in themselves and perhaps meet in the middle, or perhaps not. But essentially, we have to legitimize types of sciences that don't aim to reduce everything to the lower levels. And I think it has been, from looking back, historical point of view, it feels I don't know if the missed opportunity is the right way of expressing it, but it's unfortunate that instead of opening up the ways in which we view these systems, ecological systems, climate systems, the brain and the universe in general, in these very diverse and other ways that were new, novel ways that were possible to look at things, that never took off. And instead of that, people doubled down on the reductionistic strategy. So I do agree with you that the end result has been a dependence on a type of thinking that is now so ingrained that biologists, scientists almost can't think differently, because it becomes almost inconceivable that it could be otherwise, because that's the only way that we think. But I think we're now coming with genetics, especially after the Human Genome Project, the failure of revealing and curing all diseases, now that we have the entire genome mapped, as a monumental failure, that now scientists are a little bit perhaps more open to ways of looking at genetics, at other things, immune system, what have you, in ways that are not going to the extreme mechanistic viewpoint, and having a more systems oriented type of approach. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of time. Just one quick point, and then one hopefully quick question. The first is, I suppose, just to highlight, I think it's the work that you're doing and colleagues are doing is so important, because it's cognitive neuroscience, but it's non-reductionistic. And I think perhaps in the way that we've been trained as psychiatrists, that's been on more the kind of traditional reductionist model. So it's so fantastic to have a space to acknowledge the importance of the brain and study it without reducing it, or without reducing the phenomena associated with it down to the brain. And I think part of what comes out of that is that I'm yet to read this book yet. Context Changes Everything. I know that book. Yeah. So what's really exciting is that what comes out of that is actually, in the process of studying the brain, what you're doing is actually emphasizing the role of environment, because the context is so relevant. So the two go hand in hand. My question was, I was just thinking about this kind of idea of whether we can think about things in terms of 20% biological or whatever. And I wonder if our language is betraying us somewhat, in that I suppose what I wonder if we mean when we say X is 20% biological, we're actually talking about the extent to which it is stable under multiple different conditions. And actually, as context becomes more and more relevant, we think of it as being less biological. But of course, it's not about whether it's less or more biological. What we're actually talking about is the extent to which context, i.e. environment, changes whether the biology is causal in the way across the different conditions. Does that make any sense?
No, it does. Yeah, I think that, yeah, in terms of so I agree with everything you said, and so I might not know exactly if there's a question or was more of a comment, because it does map to sort of the issue of having this ill-defined range of influences, because it's basically too co-determined by social, cultural, environmental factors, that is not really productive to kind of just siphon everything back into the brain and say this little amygdala here is hypoactive, therefore you have depression or whatever, anxiety, or but let me just make one point about it's maybe it's parenthetic, but I'll say it anyway. It's sometimes my frustration with language is it brings back to a little bit of what you were saying. I think there's a huge problem with, I think, the way we communicate, because language is an amazing, well, it's an amazing human activity or capability or competence, but it is also an incredibly dangerous thing, because it's sort of like it's a reduces everything in some categorical fashion. It reduces things to these tokenized discrete entities that are very easy to use in a way that oversimplifies things. So it's basically a language that I think we use language for obvious reasons, but it is something that it leads to a lot of oversimplification, because we don't speak, right? So I don't speak in huge paragraphs. I speak sequentially and incoherently and whatnot. And so I do think that by using language in combination with science, we often oversimplify things in the hopes of being able to communicate it to other scientists or other individuals. So one might be aware of all sorts of nuances, but when one communicates, that background knowledge is not included in the conversation. And therefore, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation or simplification. And so just for a second, imagine that in one of the slides that I was going to have in the end, and I didn't get to, is like, okay, what do we do with our language? And so do we start, do I stop talking about cognitive phenomena, emotional phenomena? And so what do? One trivial thing is that I put a hyphen and I never say cognitive or emotional phenomena. I say cognitive emotional as a unit. Okay, and then, okay, but how much can I do that? Add a third one, cognitive, emotional, motivational, so language kind of gets in the way, and it's an enormously liberating to have language, but it's also enormously constraining in my view. And I do think that we need to build a new language. So one of the conclusions that I wanted to have was that I think we need to move away from this language that is completely tends to be enormously dichotomous. It's emotion versus cognition. It's emotion versus motivation. It's system one versus system two. Is this versus that? To use language somehow in ways that are less like that. So if we can create a language that is less about separation, but it's more about integration, I think it would be a huge progress. It would be enormous progress, because then things don't seem to be, because then the complexity of the world, it's part of that language, but it's awkward, right? Because language is temporal, and I can't spend 10 minutes here saying that, yeah, my day was, something about social, cultural, this, that, and that related to my day here in the US, because it just doesn't work. So we tend to focus on a few things and use these discrete tokens. And maybe we can create new tokens that themselves, after being used a lot, imbue in them lots of different things, but it's really hard, right? So, I mean, I guess philosophers have tried to do that and kind of do that, but aside from us humans, the rest of us normal humans really struggle to have words that have, these compound and very intricate meanings that you can then use as basic units with other terms like that. But anyway, so I digress completely, but I think language is incredibly liberating, but also is a big problem in the way that we communicate and the way that we teach, the way we write textbooks, because they're linear. You know, it's not a network that you click and you go everywhere. It's basically, you know, page 1, page 2, and I mean page 99. You are already in page 200. Great, but it's linear.
Thank you. You've managed to answer another question that I wasn't going to ask because we're out of time. I could ask a million more questions, Louis, but I've already abused my power as chair and let us run over. So I better end things there. But thank you so much for taking the time.
No, it was a great fun. Thank you very much. Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.